wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Hey everybody, Steve with the Sunday Stoic podcast here. How is your philosophical progress going? Are you living a life that is aligned with your ideals? Are you failing more than you are succeeding? These are things that I am challenged with all the time, and I find little tricks occasionally for success. For example, I've been trying to lose a little weight, and I find that if I just have a goal of losing weight, nothing happens. But if I actually download an app and keep track of calories each day, I succeed. It makes me more temperate because I know if I eat something, I have to log it. And then I have to be mindful of it. And then, therefore, I tend to tone it down. Same thing goes with exercise. Starting is so hard. But if you get into a habit, then you have incentive to not break your streak. Oh, I've been running every day for or every other day or whatever for the last month. I don't want to break that habit now. So finding those habits, what I like to call something along the lines of collateral improvement. So those keystone habits that if you change this one thing about your life, it'll start to give you temperance, strength, fortitude, etc. to succeed in other areas of your life. So I'm trying that right now. As you may know, I grew up deeply entrenched in the Catholic tradition. I was an altar boy and all that growing up. So while I don't buy into much of the mythos of the Catholic faith anymore, I do participate in Lent. So I'm trying to drop some pounds during Lent, a 40-day cycle to focus on temperance. And that's what I'm up to these next 40 days up until Easter, somewhere around the beginning of April. So I thought this week, rather than read through a bunch of Musonius Rufus again, I want to focus on more of the view from above of the teachings of Musonius Rufus. So I'm not actually going to read him at you. Instead, what I want to do is summarize what he has to say, sort of what I glean from his teachings. You are welcome to read it yourself online, etc. You might glean a completely different message from his readings, but I just felt that maybe it was good to sort of summarize it, because some of his writings are, whether or not virtue is inherent in humans. That's interesting, perhaps, from a philosophical perspective of how nature works, but maybe not so useful in terms of how to live better today than you did yesterday. So if we summarize it, we can get the kernels of ideas without spending too much time on things that maybe wouldn't benefit us too much today. So as I work through this, I'm going to kind of riff on unscripted on what he's saying, but I hope you will find some of this useful. So this is a summary of Musonius Rufus. You can find his writings online. You can purchase copies of his translations as well. But the first reading, and I'm not going to necessarily label which readings these each are, but just sort of go through them mostly in order the way he is published anyway, the order that his letters are, or his lectures are found. Once again, he didn't write down his own lectures. These are notes from a student of his. So, as we recently learned, one of the things he argues is that a teacher needs to teach well, which is something I take a heed in because that's what I do for a living. And we should use a few solid examples. If your examples aren't very good, then you're going to need even more examples. So you need to be clear. Even if you're not a teacher, you need to make sure the way you understand things is clear and coherent, and that you could teach it if you had to. If there's something in your life you're passionate about, but you couldn't explain it to somebody else and you can't do it clearly and concisely, then you probably don't actually know it very well, and you don't think about it as clearly as you should. Teaching is a great way for you as a philosopher to ensure that you understand things clearly and concisely in a way that makes sense as a whole. And so even if you are not a teacher, but you're studying philosophy, talk to a friend about it. Talk to your dog about it. Talk to your houseplant about it. See if you can explain things. And when you find those areas where you can't explain, you know you have a hole in your knowledge, and you can go back into the text and find those, fill those gaps, those knowledge gaps, and bridge those areas of your knowledge together into a cohesive whole. And as a student, you must pay diligent attention and make sure that you're thinking about what you're reading and don't accept things that are false. For example, the Stoics taught all kinds of stuff that's false. They didn't know it at the time. When you study their physics and how they thought the human body worked and things, just because a Stoic said it doesn't mean you need to accept it as truth. So think about, that's not what modern science says. That's not how the universe works. Different things like that you may have to think about and process, whether it be Stoicism or anything else you're hearing. But you must accept what you assent to as truth and then live by it. That's the trick. Develop habits of living by what you have learned. He also says that virtue is available to everyone. So once again, it's inborn. It's a human trait. He believes that everyone wants to pursue virtue. Maybe we don't all actually make a systematic habit of it, but we all have some seed of virtue in us. And being quite progressive for that era, he says that women and daughters should receive the same training as sons, because at its core, philosophy is the training in the nobility of character and nothing else. Being of good character, and no matter what your gender, he says, you need to have good character. He also goes on to say that no task should be appointed to men or women exclusively. All human tasks are common obligation. And that's something you can, if you are married, you can think about. Sometimes we still tend to fall into habits of traditional roles like, my wife does the laundry and I mow the grass. Well, maybe you need to talk about that. Maybe that's not how you should be doing things at home. Something to think about. But even Musonius thought about this back in the day. He also goes on to say that when we study philosophy like we are now, to pay more attention to practice than theory. And what's hard about that for me as a podcast host is it's a lot easier for me to talk about theory than it is to talk about practice. Because by definition, I'm just a talking head in your ear. How do I convey practice? I've thought about that some and haven't quite figured out an approach to encourage more practice. We talk about theory and the theory that encourages practice, but how do we really get to the heart of practice in an audible format? I don't know. If you have ideas, let me know. He also says that while we're studying this philosophy that we're trying to learn to practice, it's harder to learn this. We have to be okay with the fact that this is hard. It's harder to learn than he says, like being a doctor or learning music, because most people don't walk into music class for the first time or to med school they usually don't have too many preconceived notions embedded in their head about what they need to know or how music works. They know they don't know things, and they're willing to learn. But philosophy, when the practical philosophy like Stoicism that we study, has a lot to say about how to live everyday life. And we've been living everyday life since the day we were born. So we have already habits and ways of viewing the world that we have to unlearn before we can take on the new habits that we are trying to cultivate. And he says that seems to be a very difficult thing. And he says the big challenge is we must learn to see past what seems to be good and what seems to be bad, because we all know that what seems to be good from the Stoic perspective is not always good, and what seems to be bad is not necessarily bad. They are indifferent things, things that we need not focus on as much as we tend to do. He goes on to state that when we're trying to learn this philosophy and practice it, and things seem really hard, we need to remember that so many people around us undergo incredible hardships for things that are unworthy, like fame, fortune, lust. So therefore, we can take that as a form of kind of weird inspiration, in that, hey, if this person's willing to work so hard for crap that doesn't matter, I can work on being a better person, because that does matter. And he goes on to say, there is no other end for becoming good than to become happy. So that's why we are working so hard, to become happy. We are doing that via practicing virtue. And there we can get into the argument that Massimo has brought up recently, whether happiness is the supreme good or virtue. Is virtue a way to become happy, or is happiness a side effect of virtue but not worth pursuing on its own? I'll let you worry about that. I say just practice your philosophy and don't get bogged down in whiny details like that. I know some people think it's really important, and I don't care. But nothing good comes without toil, he says. If you're not worthy to exert yourself, you're not worthy of the good. If you're not willing to work hard for it, you don't deserve it. He also says that leaders like kings and other leaders need to study philosophy, because it is vital that our leaders, that those in authority, avoid believing in falsehoods, and that they are courageous, and that they are temperate and just. Therefore, it's very important that those in leadership positions understand philosophy. And what about if you are exiled? In Roman times, you might be sent away. You might be put on a desert island like Musonius himself was. In the modern world, maybe that's not the case, but you might be ostracized from your own family or your community. And he reminds us, I feel exiled sometimes. I'm hundreds of miles away from my family. I only get to see my mom and dad and brother a couple times a year if I'm lucky. And that's very hard on me emotionally, if I let it get to me. But he says, exile is not an evil. You still have the sun and stars. You can still have friends and water to drink. And the only reason why living in exile, and in this case he means exile, far away from your family, but also living in a tiny hut without any possessions, it will only be a burden on you if you wish you had luxury. But if you are okay not having luxury, then living simply with a few friends and the sun above you and the moon above you is okay. You're fine. The philosopher knows that disgrace does not lie in enduring these things, but inflicting them. So when it comes to being a good person and responding to the way you're treated, if you understand that people treating you bad is not really a bad thing, it's their problem, not yours. It's not disgraceful for you to endure those things, but it is disgraceful for you to inflict those things. So he goes on to say that a good Stoic would not sue somebody who has harmed them or who has sent them to exile, right? They wouldn't do that because that would be shameful. But let's be clear. He actually did bring charges against a fellow Stoic who had betrayed another Stoic to Nero and had them killed. And after Nero's fall, he brought that other person to court. He's willing to pursue lawsuits for the sake of justice, but not for the sake of feeling bad. So if it's just to pursue someone legally, then it's okay, but not just because you feel bad. He suggests that you need to reevaluate why you're doing things. In another reading, he goes on to say that all of this stuff is hard. So what kind of life would be required to be able to pull this off, to be able to spend time on philosophy, to be able to stew on it and have time to read? Well, he suggests that the best job that you can have is that of a farmer. Farming gives you a practical training in philosophy and time to ponder things while you're, walking behind the plow and things like that. And if you have a good mentor, he says, like if you're farming and you have a mentor you live with who is a philosophical farmer, you will learn a lot more by watching that person live a good life than you ever could hearing lots of lectures about the good life. So do you have any mentors that you can watch that you have learned from how to live a good life by observing? I wish I had more examples that I could say I could really observe this. I have people I admire, but I don't know if I have that kind of mentor at hand. He goes on to go, what reminds me of my Catholic upbringing, where he says that sex should only occur in the bonds of marriage and for the purposes of procreation, and that the point of marriage is about two people supporting each other and producing young, of course. I like, he does say something that's very modern here, where he says it's worse when one spouse fixes their attention elsewhere and does not pull together with their yoke-mate, as if you and your spouse are both, oxen pulling a plow. If your spouse is busy off doing something else, not paying attention to this marriage you've cultivated, then you are bearing the burden of it, and that will lead to unhappiness pretty quickly. But he says if you do get married, be sure they are of good character, because you're not going to fix that other person. He even says that a crooked piece of wood cannot be made straight. So he's saying you're not going to fix them. Don't marry someone who's a fixer-upper. That's not your job. But he says it is a great way for you to practice philosophy. It actually helps you to practice philosophy to be married. It is not a hindrance to philosophy, because we as humans, as he says, are bees. We are like bees. We live together in communities. We are not isolated wild beasts. So being married is a natural condition that did not hinder Socrates. It did not hinder other philosophers. It's a way for you to practice your philosophy. He also says it's far better to leave brothers for your child, let's just say siblings, than money. I wish I could provide my son with a brother or sister, but it's probably not in the cards for us at this point. But he says children should obey their parents, but he says sometimes obeying your parents doesn't look like obeying your parents, at least from your parents' perspective, because he says ultimately your parents' ultimate goal for you is to do what is best and what is right. And so an example in his reading is there's this kid who wants to study philosophy, and his dad says, no, you're going to do something else. But he says, well, your dad doesn't understand philosophy. It is for your best good to pursue it. So following that goal is not necessarily betraying your father's desires, even though he may feel that way at first. And he kind of puts it this way. If you know how to steer a ship, but your father doesn't, you would not take his orders on how to steer the ship, during a storm. If you know what's best, and you're philosophical and your father isn't, it is not disobedient to pursue what is good, because ultimately, even though your parents may be misguided, their ultimate goal for you is the good. And if you know better what is the good than they do, then perhaps you should pursue it anyway. Of course, you have to be really sure that you are right and they're wrong. And so when you're 15, don't assume you know that. So he also says that to prepare for old age, philosophy is the best medicine, because it can allow us to be happy in virtually any condition. He says wealth is something that, people think they need in their old age, and it can buy you pleasures, but it cannot buy you cheerfulness of spirit. And he says there are so many examples of wretched rich people that you should know by now that to be happy in your old age is not, it's not a given that being wealthy will help you succeed in that. Yeah, having enough to eat and a roof over your head is probably a good starting place for happiness. But beyond that, having more and more and more. Usually, I know this from relatives that I have. I hope they're listening. No. That once you have more than those around you, then you think you deserve even more than those around you. And it becomes a snowball effect of unhappiness. Then he has several readings, which I'm just going to summarize here at the end. When it comes to eating, when it comes to clothing, when it comes to shelter, when it comes to self-care, live simply. When it comes to eating, you have 3 or 4 chances a day to be intemperate or temperate. That is like the biggest challenge. The best test of your Stoic character is your diet, because you have so many chances to fail every day or so many chances to succeed every day. He says to eat what is easy to obtain, what is in season, what is easy to pick. He suggests eating vegetarian meals, a simple diet, to wear functional, non-fancy clothing that is easy to obtain, that just protects you but doesn't look funny doesn't look fancy. Something simple but effective. He says that sturdy, cheap cookware is better than hard to maintain pots that are going to be broken or stolen. He says that the cheaper and the more serviceable something is, the better. So he would not be a fan of our disposable culture. He says things which are really good are not recognized by the foolish, and only things that seem good are sought out by the foolish. So going after expensive, hard to maintain, hard to keep up with, difficult to obtain stuff is not the way to go to live the philosophical life. Even when it comes to hair, he says, treat it like you'd prune a vine. Remove only what is useless. He thinks that men should grow a beard because it's a protective covering that nature provides, much like the lion's mane. It makes you stand out. But that is kind of a summary of his teachings. Live simply. Don't pursue things that are difficult to obtain just because they're fancy. Live simply. Study philosophy. It's hard, but it's worth it. Seek out a solid family structure. Live a simple life. Do no harm to others, but acknowledge that people will sometimes harm you, but it's their fault, not yours. Don't fall for falsehoods. Work on your practice of philosophy. It will be hard, but it is worth it. Work on your nobility of character. And there is no other end for becoming good than to become happy. So, that's a summary of the philosopher Musonius Rufus. If you want to suggest future topics or anything you want to hear about on the show, or you want to say hi or let me know where you're listening from, please shoot me an email at sundaystoic@gmail.com. And until then, I got to get back at it. So have a good weekend and seize the day. Carpe diem.